My name is Vince Biztek. I'm the executive editor of the Denver Gazette, and this is our Denver Gazette 9 News Town Hall on Youth Violence. Fusillade of violent crimes in Denver involving teenagers and children, both as perpetrators and victims, prompted editors and reporters at the Denver Gazette a few months ago to launch a series of stories called Kids in the Crossfire. We wanted to explore why the violent deaths of 12 to 18-year-olds have suddenly become normalized in Denver. Why has gunfire with young people pulling the trigger become so constant that at times it has seemed omnipresent in our city? What are the root causes of this surge, or is it just perception? More broadly, we wanted to talk about how children are navigating life in an era of school shootings and an uptick in gang violence. So the Denver Gazette and 9 News are teaming up because we want to try to help find some answers. This town hall will focus on practical, pragmatic steps that we can all take to help stem the tide and build a better community free from the harms of violence. We have a really distinguished panel tonight, and our discussion will be live streamed and available at denvergazette.com and 9news.com. We also have a video available later with our broadcasts, with our stories online. Our moderator tonight is Steve Steger, an anchor and reporter for 9 News who covers crime and justice and politics. Steve joined 9 News in March 2014 as a general assignment reporter and is also a contributor to Next with Kyle Clark. He has been nominated for an Emmy for his reporting on fraud, and we're glad to have him here, and he will introduce our panelists. So Steve, take it away.
Vince, thank you so much. I want to say a warm welcome to everyone in the crowd here. Give yourselves a round of applause for coming out on a Tuesday night. All right, I have the privilege of introducing our panel this evening, I should say. Tells you where my head is. By the way, Vince said I cover politics. Today I covered pickleball, so my story count is all over the place. Let's go through our panel, starting with Beth McCann. She's made juvenile justice a top priority during her 7 years as Denver District Attorney. McCann was also a leader in criminal justice matters throughout her career as a state legislator as well. I'm going to make you applaud for everybody. Applaud for Beth McCann, please. Your hands are going to be numb at the end of this. Melissa Yanishevsky. I got it right. She said it's like Yanni, a chef, and ski. She is the executive director of Denver's Office of Children's Affairs. Melissa works closely with city and state agencies and program staff to improve outcomes for Denver families and children. And she's also a professor at the DU Graduate School of Social Work. How about a hand for Melissa? Angela Lawson has served on the Aurora City Council now for 8 years. She previously worked at the Colorado Secretary of State's office as a program manager in the Elections Division. She has been instrumental in securing funding for the Youth Violence Prevention Program here in the city of Aurora. How about a hand for Councilmember Lawson? Jonathan McMillan is the director of the Office of Gun Violence Prevention at the Colorado Department of Public Health and Education. Jonathan has led Denver's Youth Violence Prevention Action Table and implemented the city's strategic plan to reduce and prevent community violence. How about a hand for Jonathan? Rika Rodriguez-Hernandez is the director of the Urban Impact Team for Lifeline Colorado. It's a program providing gang violence intervention and prevention and other support services for at-risk kids. How about a hand for Rika? And Tracy Durant is a sociology and criminology professor at the University of Denver. She's also been executive director of Step by Step Youth Services, which provides mentoring, therapeutic, and other services to underserved populations across Colorado. How about a hand for Tracy? And finally, Sarah Goodrum is a research professor at the Center for the Study of Prevention of Violence. Dr. Goodrum's research focuses on school violence prevention, homicide victimization, domestic violence, and the criminal justice system. How about a hand for Dr. Goodrum? All right, so we are going to keep things relatively loose. Panel, I would ask that you try to keep your answers to around a minute, but please Feel free to jump in if you hear something and you want to be part of a conversation on a question. I have questions directly for each of you. We'll start with DA McCann. So we've heard anecdotally, and statewide data seems to reflect this, that kids on the whole have been getting charged with more serious crimes such as gun prevention or gun possession, shootings, homicides than just a decade or so ago. Does there seem to be a pattern of kids getting involved in more violent behavior, and are prosecutors making decisions to try to bring these serious charges and more of them than before?
Yes, I would say that since I've been in office about 6.5 years now, we have seen a progression of not just the numbers of cases committed by juveniles, but the level of violence has really increased. And I think that's what's been the most shocking thing for me when I came in as DA, to see the kinds of crimes that young people are committing, and particularly the gun cases have definitely increased. And so I think throughout the metro area, DAs are filing more serious cases against young people because they are committing more serious crimes.
Did that tend to go up during the pandemic, or was that just?
Interesting, during the pandemic, crime initially went down overall because I think people were not out and about. But as the pandemic began to ease up, if you will, I do think that because we didn't have the same social structures in place that we had prior to the pandemic, like recreation centers, churches, libraries, places where kids could go, those social structures not being in place had a big impact, I think, particularly on young people. So I do think that the pandemic definitely had an influence, but not right in the beginning. It's sort of later.
Down the road.
Yeah.
We're experiencing it now. Melissa, one of our audience members actually asked this question. Do too many resources go towards intervention rather than prevention?
The short answer is yes. Historically, most funding goes towards intervention rather than prevention. And we know that prevention is really the most essential component to a child's success. We're trying to change that. And it's slow because prevention takes time. Intervention is something that we need to do right now. The way that you can think about it is that 70% of adults in this country will experience a traumatic experience within their lifetime. And so prevention is really trying to take action before something becomes an emergency. And so we're really trying to devote a lot of our efforts, at least at the Office of Children's Affairs, to focus on our prevention.
What would you say is the most basic form of prevention?
It's just starting, the earlier, the better. So our office works prenatal to age 24. It's starting at the prenatal stage, making sure that young people have access to services and supports, that we're talking to them earlier on, so that we can really support them throughout the continuum of age, so they have a smooth transition to adulthood.
Jonathan wants to say something.
I would just back that with a caring, trusted adult consistently in a young person's life.
I agree.
From cradle to grave, right? It's about having that person who a young person can go to learn from, who they can confide in, who they can, if they experience a traumatic event, someone who is there to help them heal and grow through that experience.
What are the missing resources there in your mind?
The missing resources?
Either to both of you, in that prevention space of having the stable person.
I just think that you can't have one without the other. So you do have to have intervention and you have to pair it with prevention. But I think oftentimes we want a solution really quickly. And so what's missing in prevention is just allocated resources to make sure that all of the organizations that are doing this work every single day have what they need to support young people.
And I just want to comment on the intervention piece. I know that we probably need more in the prevention. In the city of Aurora, you know, we allocate $500,000 in our prevention and intervention. So 400 goes to intervention, and then 100,000 goes to prevention. But I do think that on the intervention side, we can maybe capture some of these youth that maybe have started in the wrong path and then get them out of that path. So I still think it's really equally important to make sure that we do intervention as well.
Speaking of cities, Councilmember Lawson, this question's for you. are Metro Denver cities working together and collaborating enough when it comes to dealing with these issues? And if they aren't, where are the gaps?
Okay, well, originally in November 2020, we did a Aurora Denver Compact. And that to me it was signed by Mayor Hancock and was also signed by Mayor Kaufman, where we were supposed to actually work together on resources, doing pop-up events, working together on data and everything, a lot of collaboration. That stopped, which I think, it's jurisdictional, it's borders. And we do need to make sure that we have, I hope that revamps itself, because I think it's really important because it is jurisdictional and does cross borders, youth violence. So I think it's very important. We have to, this is a regional issue. This isn't just the city of Aurora and the city of Denver. It is regional because it's cross borders. We're seeing violence in all parts of our state and in our cities. But a lot of the focus is in the urban areas, which is Denver and Aurora. So I think the collaboration is going to be significant, and I'm hoping that we can get that Aurora-Denver compact together amongst maybe adding other cities into the compact as well.
Are there roadblocks there, though, or are there areas where cities aren't collaborating like the way that they should?
I think in resources, I think that in the resource space, I don't think we're collaborating as we should. I think what I'm seeing is a lot of silos. We have organizations that are doing a lot of good things. But I think that where I'm seeing is the silos, and I think what's happening with the organizations is they're really saying, what does that organization do? And what does that organization do? So we're gonna have to really, I think a concept or an idea that I hope that the city of Aurora may brings forth is bringing these organizations together that we fund, and maybe other jurisdictions fund, and then sit down and say, what do you do? And actually bring some of the youth that are part of those to see if they're effective.
Very interesting. Let's move on to Jonathan. Questions for you about unsecured firearms. Is that a major source of guns for kids in the household? And what do you think that we ought to do about that? Like, where are kids getting guns, and do they often come from folks who just aren't keeping their guns in the right place?
Great question, Steve. And the short answer is yes. Unsecured firearms are a major source of violent acts, whether it's community violence, gang violence, because if someone breaks into a house or a vehicle and there's a loaded, unsecured firearm in either one of those locations, that firearm typically tends to go out and be used in the commission of a crime. Just as importantly, unsecured loaded firearms inside the home. Let me back up just a bit. When we tend to have this conversation about gun violence or firearm injury and death, we tend to only think about community violence, gang violence. However, as disheartening and as critical as that issue is, youth suicide is just as, if not more, alarming. And if a young person who is in a space where they are having suicidal ideation and they have access to a firearm, that is a recipe for disaster. So one of the things that my office is encouraging, especially with households that have firearms in them, is that they do secure their firearms with whether a gun case, a trigger lock, a cable lock, or something that is going to at least reduce the access to lethal means for young people, or the attractiveness of that firearm being stolen and used by someone who shouldn't have access to it.
I hear the Denver police chief talk about that ad nauseum. Like, that's something that he feels that needs to be legislated, that there need to be safe storage laws. Where would you fall on that?
We actually do have safe storage laws on the books here.
Better safe storage laws, though.
What's that?
We need better laws?
I don't know if we need better laws.
We need people to obey the law. I mean, we have the law. It is, you have to store your firearms safely, but people don't do that.
Yeah, and this, I mean, the reality of the matter is, one of the reasons we have law enforcement as a society is, as Dean Can just mentioned, people don't always obey the law. And so, to me, the next best thing is what I mentioned earlier, is making sure that you're doing that upstream prevention so that people are able to develop those emotional intelligence so that they know how to handle conflict. They know how to handle despair. They know that they have a caring, trusted adult consistently in their life who they can go to in those times of stress and trauma. And then the next best thing is making sure that, well, I would say, again, at the same time, it's securing those firearms for when those upstream preventions don't work.
All right, Rika, move on to you now. Tell us a little bit more about the strategies. First of all, tell us about Lifeline and what it is, and then tell us about the strategies Lifeline uses.
Absolutely. So Lifeline is a nonprofit organization that provides wraparound services for several populations exiting the Department of Corrections. We provide a lot of support, but youth-focused, we really provide gang intervention and prevention. We provide mentorship. We work within 26 Denver public schools doing one-on-one case management with the youth. We provide supportive and incentive services so that when we're working with our youth and they're meeting a barrier, maybe the parents are struggling with paying bills, or the youth needs some equipment for clothing, we're able to buy those supplies for them so that they can continue to move forward with their goals. We work heavily under an individual service plan, and so this is a 100% voluntary program. We don't force anybody to go through our program. It is a program to help empower them and to help really give them the tools and the coping mechanisms and methods that they need to be able to deal with all of the background noise of high school and all of the pressures that come with middle school and high school. We are also recognizing that we need to start younger. I historically have focused on high schools, but we're looking into starting to work that middle school instead, to be able to help them, again, develop those coping mechanisms to be able to deal with the stressors of the world. Lifeline's an amazing organization. I've never, ever seen an organization like it. When I was young and I was in those lanes and gang banging, I would have prayed that something was there to help me along, but we're moving and we're shaking and we're learning and we're really helping to advance people to an empowerment phase.
If folks want to get in touch and they're watching right now, what do they need to do?
So you can go to www.lifelinecolorado.org. You can always email me. I'm always happy to connect people. We do have a QR code where you can send a direct referral. I can give you that information following if that would be helpful. But yeah, emailing me would be ideal.
All right, Rika, thank you. Tracy, you're on the front lines with youth, with gangs. So what's your experience working with kids in these situations? What do you find that they need, and what's their perspective on all this?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I am going to read a little bit because I'm just so nervous that it's easier for me to
perfectly
answer this
fine.
way. But
As you can tell, I am too.
I did run these questions by the youth that I work with. I thought it was really important to kind of get their perspective as well. And so that's definitely incorporated into kind of what I want to talk about. Talking about what youth need is such an enormous question, you could spend hours and hours talking about that. But for the purposes of this panel, I just want to focus on a couple different things. We know that one of the biggest risk factors for youth getting in trouble and joining gangs is a lack of supervision. When parents are working and they're not home, or there's neglect, or there's something else going on, and the kids just have time to run around, that's where you can get into trouble. So the first thing that we need is prevention, like we've been talking about, and I see that as young as elementary school, putting services in place to help young people navigate feelings and behaviors. One way we can do this is by implementing different skill-based groups for younger people, and then as they get older, introducing CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy, or DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, which helps with like executive functioning, impulse control, emotional regulation, those kinds of things. We can also implement prevention in the way of after-school programming and access to things like sports and different clubs. By the time I see youth in the system, that's already kind of too late. We're doing intervention techniques, and those have like a high recidivism rate. So one of the biggest protective factors that young people can have is, like Jonathan has been talking about, having a trusted adult that they can go to for guidance. That person can also serve to help them set and reach goals. And we can do this with mentors and providing funding for programs and nonprofits that help with mentorship. It'd be ideal if the mentor could mirror people in the neighborhood, so recruitment at the high school level or college level, and looking at young people who mirror the kids that they're working with. Another thing we can do is provide a blueprint for educational and employment opportunities for older youth. A lot of kids that I work with, I just registered a kid today who's been gang involved his whole life. He's 19, and we just got him enrolled at CCD, Community College of Denver, and he was so excited. It was just like the biggest deal for him. He got his picture and his ID, and it's a big deal. So yeah, thank you. They don't think about those things. They don't think it's possible to go to college or trade school. And so that trusted adult that Jonathan's talking about, helping them say, you know what, you can do this. This is how you do it. Showing them, taking them down there, doing it with them. So helping them navigate the system is so important.
I love that story.
I'd like to piggyback off that as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
I absolutely agree with both of y'all. I think people who have lived experience and can actually touch with those kiddos or the youth and really make a connection, a legit connection, that they know that you have been through something similar of what they've been through. At Lifeline, we hire everybody, of all of our staff is 100% people of lived experience. So either have been locked up, either have been dealt with substance misuse, have been in gang involvement themselves. I feel like it's imperative for our youth to be able to connect to somebody who looks like them, who talks like them, and who actually feels like them.
Can I just chime in?
Absolutely.
And so, I deal with a group of youth, they're at risk, and a lot of things that they tell us about in the city of Aurora specifically is things to do. We have to meet these kids where they're at in terms of wherever they're at in there. And I agree with your programs, that's exactly right. Not all kids are college oriented. A lot of them are trades. A lot of them, are trying to do other things. Like, for example, I have a kid that likes music, rap music. I'm like, instead of going out doing what you're doing, why don't you get the trade, bring your friends along, have a business, entrepreneurship, mentorship. These are type of things that I'm hoping that we can do more of. We have to really meet these kids where they're at, because every kid is in a different place. And not everybody, I'm trying to get kids to go to school, but they're like, Councilmember Lawson, I don't want to go to school. This is not me. So again, I think we have to look at how things have changed, even since I've been a youth, about how we do our programming and what we're actually offering to our youth today.
Steve, I want to just add one more thing here. We also need to be cognizant of the fact that not every young person is going to be in the gang. And not every gang member is actually going to pick up a firearm. And not every gang member who picks up a firearm is actually going to be a shooter. So when we start to break down the reality of the situation of how very few youth are actually the ones that are at the highest risk and maybe at the highest need for services, it becomes a much more manageable issue, where each of us in the room, literally, if each one of us in the room really wanted to reach out to one of those gang members or one of those young people who are most at risk of picking up a firearm, we would probably have more than enough people in this room right now for the city and county of Denver and probably Aurora. Now, the issue is we start to have conversations like no one's doing anything. We just heard about Lifeline. I see Southwest Vita in the room. I see there's dozens upon dozens of organizations out here who are really working hard to make a difference and do the work. And there's plenty of programs. The issue is, and it's not to say that Lifeline or Southwest Vita or any of those ones, we need to make sure that we're finding programs for that small percentage of young people who aren't going to the programs, right? There's Boys and Girls Clubs, there's athletic programs, there's STEM programs, there's music programs. If those kids aren't connecting to those programs, then we need to find programs for those kids. You don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, continue the programs, because that is the prevention. It's intensive, specific intervention for young people who are at high risk and high need, and it's a really low number.
All right, Dr. Goodwin, let's move on to you. I'm curious, tell us more about what the Center for Study and Prevention at CU brings to the table here.
Okay, so at the Center for the Study and Prevention of Violence at the University of Colorado Boulder, one of our goals is to take research evidence that we have about strategies for preventing violence and putting that research into practice. But there's oftentimes a big gap between what we read about in the research literature and what we see in practice. And so part of the work we try to do is translate the information that we know from research so that programs and communities, nonprofit organizations, K through 12 schools can take that information and put it to good use.
I'm going to say, I've read some of the studies before, and sometimes that's over even my head, and I've covered this an awful lot. I'll stay with you. What lessons has the center learned from school shootings, and what do you take away from those when it comes to making kids safer?
Yes, we've learned some really difficult, tragic lessons from school shootings. And one of the cases that our center was involved doing research on, it was the attack at Arapahoe High School from 2013. And our center was involved in looking at what lessons could be learned from that case. The family of the victim, Claire Davis, reached an agreement with the school district to do what's called an investigative arbitration, where we interviewed the school staff who had contact with the student who had been engaging in some troubling behavior in the year prior to his violent attack. And they had conducted a threat assessment of him. And then they didn't do much to monitor him after that. And so in our review of those interviews with school staff, we learned that some of the challenges are that, number one, threat assessment is difficult to conduct with students of concern in school settings because you don't always get all the information you need about the struggles that the student's experiencing. As you can probably imagine, parents aren't real excited to hear that their students caused some trouble, made threatening comments, and we need to do an inquiry to understand the level of concern that student presents. And so conducting that threat assessment process can be quite challenging. And then educating the staff on the warning signs to look for when you see a student going down the wrong path, and how do you try to intervene with that student to get them back on the right track? Can be very challenging.
Jonathan, I see you bobbing. You got something to say. I know you have something to say.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with Sarah. And those are the type of complex and comprehensive solutions that we have to really explore. Oftentimes, we want the intervention, and the intervention could be anything from more services for that young person, which are needed. I'm never saying that, or more services at a city level, or more services or more legislation at the Capitol. It's hard to legislate being concerned and involved in someone else's life when you see an issue. And if nothing else, during my time as the director of the Office of Gun Violence Prevention, I want people to really recognize that they play a role in making sure that we all are safe, or happy, healthy, and hopeful, right? And that may just be, Steve, are you okay, right? It may be, do you need someone to talk to? And then following up on that. And then our government leaders, myself included, making sure that there is a framework that supports the support that other people are offering. Didn't sound as articulate coming out as it was in my head.
It's amazing how much it all boils back down to empathy at the end of the day. Like just having empathy for someone and taking that moment to say, is everything all right? Yeah. Tracy, we'll move back. We went all the way down. We're going to move all the way back up. So dominant wisdom for decades seems to have been that youth get involved in gangs because they want a sense of belonging. Is that still the thinking that experts think about the main reason kids get involved in gangs? And if so, what needs to be done to give kids an environment to feel accepted so they don't turn to the influence of gangs?
Again, such a big question, but you know, when I think about the gang stuff, there's like this certain allure to the gang lifestyle, which makes it glamorous to some youth, you know? So I think that's a piece of what we're dealing with. And when we're talking about youth that are gang involved, we're talking about concepts like power, pride, and respect, and the intersection of neighborhood and family gang involvement, which all of those things can lead youth into gangs. You know, with that sense of belonging and family or safety protection that you're talking about, I do think that that's still dominant wisdom. And the kids that I spoke with today and that I've worked with over the years, I think would say the same thing. You know, when looking at power, pride, and respect, if we can help youth redefine those same words in a more pro-social way, it can be super impactful. For example, the word pride, when we talk about the gang definition of the word pride, we're talking about pride in your hood, right? Like pride in your colors, pride in your neighborhood, where you live. And if we can redefine that in a more pro-social way, we can start talking about pride in community, pride in your culture. And if we can get kids, which I've had success with that, if we can get kids to redefine that, like I said, it can be really impactful. And that gives us a chance at helping them step away from the gang lifestyle and becoming more pro-social adults. And then I would just go back to my previous answer about putting in prevention services as young as elementary school to help negate some of the allure of the gang lifestyle. I can't stress enough the importance of prevention programs so that youth don't even think about joining gangs as an option. Like, once they've gotten to, I'm gonna join a gang or I might join a gang, like, it's too late. That's not prevention anymore, right? And when we talk about, like Jonathan was talking about, not every gang member, you know, shoots a gun, but a lot of gang members do have guns for protection, right? And so if we can prevent youth from joining gangs, then we also can prevent some of the, you know, the gun violence that we see today. I really believe that, so.
I want to circle back real quick on that idea of pride. Is that simply having a conversation about how you define pride, or is that just working in the community, being in community? How do you create that?
Yeah, I think that you can have that conversation about the definition, you know, what do you see pride as? This is how I think I see you seeing pride, and this is kind of how I see pride, and then where do you kind of fit in that? But I also think there's more subtle ways to do it. I've done a lot of stuff with kids, just buying them books. You know, maybe I buy them a Malcolm X book instead of an urban fiction book, and then we have a conversation about what that book meant to them and kind of did they relate to any of the things, and you know, the pride in the community, having conversations about, like, what would it mean for you to be a good neighbor? You know, what does that look like? Because a lot of times kids, you know, live in apartment complexes or live in places where they don't really have respect, right? They play the music loud all night, they are in and out, they have people, and they don't think about that empathy of how it affects other people. So just like having those kinds of conversations, I think starts that building of the pride, even if they don't know what that is right away. But it's that's kind of a slow process, right? And we're talking about kids that are already gang involved in intervention versus that prevention piece. If we're talking about prevention in elementary school, we start instilling pride in a different way. Pride for them becomes pride in my school, community, my family, that kind of thing, and then we don't have to worry about the more antisocial definition of pride.
Can I just chime in a little bit? Sorry, my throat is crappy there. But I think we got to talk about the bigger animal in the room, which is a hard topic to talk about, social media. The imagery of social media, Instagram, Facebook, you know, and what you see on those things, and how a lot of these kids are trying to implement, you know, the individuals that are on there. The kids that I talk to, you know, they say, Councilmember Lawson, it's money. It's what I wear. It's trying to be impressive to the young women, and vice versa. The women, the young girls are into this as well. And how do you equate? You're right, we got to do prevention efforts, show these kids at this lower level, like, how can we do something different besides going into that lifestyle? I always tell the kids this, because they're teaching me a lot about all these, how they can obtain guns and things like that. You have choices. Is it jail or death? And I want you around. and you have a purpose in the life. Your voice matters in our community and in your neighborhood, and you can make a difference. So whether they listen to me or not, I think it's really important to have those real conversations. But looking at social media and what that brings to the forefront of everything, which is a whole bigger conversation, I think has a lot to do with it too.
It was interesting, this panel, before we got up here, we were talking about the internet, and we brought up AOL, and it made me think about how far the internet has come since all of us
Don't
were
call
kids.
me out.
I wish I still had an AOL account. I'm kind of curious, and this is really for all of you on that point. Is there a way, we always talk about the demonization of social media when it comes to this. Is there a way social media can help, or is it just always awful?
I think there could be a lot of positive
Yeah.
aspects of social media. I also think one of the bigger issues that I talk to my students about and young people about is in this country we have this mentality of picking yourself up by the bootstraps, and I think it could be very damaging to all of us because it destroys connection, it destroys someone's ability to ask for help, it limits our ability to have conversation with somebody else. And we also just stopped thinking about, it does take a village to raise a child in our communities. And oftentimes we turn a blind eye. And I think that could be really hurtful and harmful to young people because they need support. Social media could be very positive. It has brought people together. If you think about the pandemic, it brought all of us together in a time when we were all stuck at home and feeling a lot of despair and hopelessness. And so I do agree that there are some pieces of social media. It's 24/7. It's a one-way interaction. I think that could be really hurtful and harmful for young people and for adults too. But there are a lot of positive things that can come out of it. It's the way that we shift our culture and our narrative.
We'll go Rika and then Sarah.
So, COVID, it was huge on isolating and really leaving our youth with nothing really to do other than sit around and watch, gangster rap videos and all the glorifying movies that glorify violence and, social media along with video games. I think all of these things were a contributing factor of why we're seeing so much violence now, because they've lost the ability to be social. They've lost the ability to know that pride and respect and loyalty. And another thing that the gangs that we're working with today is there's nothing like they used to be back in the day. There's no the loyalty, honor, respect. It's all hybrid. They're all collaborating with other gangs, and so it's everybody out to get their own, and everybody out to make the big dollar on their own, and they'll take out whoever they have to take out in order to get that. So I think social media is huge. It can definitely be positive, but I don't know that the youth are going to those positive pages to go and check out all of the inspirational quotes, and they're going to all of those hard gang social media sites where they're gaining knowledge and tools to be able to go out and do the dirt and do it right.
They're not going to Pinterest and looking for the
Right.
next big quote. Sarah?
Yes, I do think that there can be some upsides to how we use social media to educate the public about the warning signs for violence and the importance of upstander reporting. And at the University of Colorado, we're going to be piloting an awareness campaign on violence prevention starting in the fall, where we're going to try to use the university's social media platforms to do a couple of things. One, educate the public on what the warning signs for violence look like. Two, what should they do when they see those warning signs? Please be an upstander and report it. And then three, what are the resources that are available to community members, to all of us, that we might call upon when we see somebody that's engaging in some really concerning behavior with firearms, with threatening communications, or perhaps with aggression. And one of the things we know from prior mass shootings is that in investigation after investigation, we learned that people noticed something was wrong with the attacker prior to their attack. There were warning signs, there was troubling behavior. In the case in Parkland, Florida, the attacker in that case had more than 40 encounters with police prior to his deadly rampage. And yet, not enough was done to intervene with that individual. We're hoping that with this public awareness campaign, we can do some of that early prevention that we're talking about, where you're raising the public's awareness about what this looks like and how you should respond when you see it unfolding. And the idea is that we could try to intervene sooner when you see those signs popping up.
I think I saw DA McCann's hand go up earlier.
Well, I was just going to say, we see social media used for young, particularly men, to display their guns and brag. This culture, we worship guns. I get very frustrated with this idea that, I'm a macho because I have a gun. And so I think that is can be a very negative influence on young people when they see other young people that look like them with an AR-15 or a series of handguns. So I do think that there's that negative piece. Also, we see a lot of crimes being planned in text messages. It's actually a great tool for the police because we can often track what caused a crime or who was involved in it through cell phones and social media posts. So, it goes both ways, I guess.
Certainly. Jonathan, you had your hand up too.
I'm going to sound like a broken record. Caring, trusted adult consistently in a young person's life. That includes monitoring social media, instilling values of respect for self, respect for others, having those tough conversations about what is appropriate, what's inappropriate on social media sites. The next best thing, if say that an adult isn't available or isn't consistently in a young person's life, is the peers. With CSPV, Center for the Study and Prevention of Violence, for the last maybe 3 years or so, I've consulted on a program where a group of young people have been trained to identify when conflict is arising and brewing to the level where they are able to, and they're empowered to, through training and other facilitation skills, to at least intervene, to try to mediate the conflict, and then make a caring, trusted adult who's a part of their team aware of the situation. So hopefully the intervention can happen. Also, again, I want to shout out some young people who are in the audience right now, Southwest Vita. While their platform is not mainly on social media, they have what once was a small newsletter. It is now a magazine where they're highlighting what is happening in their neighborhood, the positive that's happening in their neighborhood, the community, the youth leaders that are doing the work in their neighborhood, and then sharing it via social media platforms. This is youth leadership, that's youth violence prevention.
Can I just add to something that Jonathan said?
Absolutely.
And Jonathan, I understand that, definitely we need to have parental, looking at this social media. If they see something, say something. But in some of the kids' lives that I know or have talked with, they don't have that structure. A lot of them are just trying to survive. A lot of them are trying to, help their families with economics. A lot of them are trying to just live. So sometimes it's hard. They don't have the parent in the home or the structure. So they're kind of just out there just trying to make ends meet for their families and do, whatever they can. So I agree to you to that point, but then that's another issue on that side too, of where the parents come in, and then when there is no structure of parenting as well.
Yeah, and that's where folks like Tracy and Rita, myself, and others step up in that gap and be that caring, trusted adult.
Makes sense. All right. I got off track. Thank you for indulging what started with AOL. Who knows where that went, how that got there. Rika, let's go to you. And this probably is a question for everyone on the panel. How big of a role does mental health and substance abuse play in pushing kids over the edge?
Wow, it's huge. Like I mentioned before, COVID really exacerbated the violence and the ability for our youth to be able to cope and deal with everyday stressors. I think really by providing a lot of creative treatment options, because our youth doesn't always want to involve themselves in the traditional therapy, right? So we have to really be creative in how we're talking to them, how we're approaching them, you know, really meeting them where they're at. Somebody said earlier, you have to meet them where they're at. We literally meet them in the park, at their school, you know, wherever they're comfortable meeting us at. They don't always want to come into the Youth Empowerment Building, but I feel like when you're touching on the mental health piece in a creative way, it doesn't always lead to, oh, you've got a problem. You've got a mental health problem. Like if you're really discussing it in a way like where you're normalizing the conversation and you're letting the youth know, like, everybody's got mental health. Everybody does. And just don't think you're special because I've got mental health problems too, you know? So like normalizing those conversations is huge for our youth, to let them know, like, it's okay. It's okay.
It's really a shame that we've gotten into that stigma place where it comes to like just seeking help for mental health issues. I've never been able to understand that.
Yeah.
I want to just add on to what she was saying, because I think it's really important, because if you think about our mental health and substance use policies in this country, they're based on the idea that mental health and substance use is a moral failing. And when you develop policies with that in mind, it oppresses the people that actually need the support. So having creative solutions, meeting young people where they are, letting them know that it's okay, that we are all experiencing some type of mental health or substance use issue in the past, present, whatever it may be, I think it starts to slowly break down that stigma that we all have.
I've noticed it even with colleagues. When you start talking about the fact that you're dealing with something, people are a lot more likely to talk about what's going on in their lives and seek the help that they need. I mean, I think we all could do that. It's not just a youth thing. Sorry, sidetracked there. Jonathan, back to you. Let's talk about parents, shall we? They may be watching. What can parents and families do to prevent gang involvement, and what are some resources that are available for families?
Oh boy, be caring, be consistent, be trusted.
Being there, it
Being
sounded like
there.
you were saying.
I'm joking, but I'm not. And I have less than a minute to try to explain how to be an involved parent, and maybe I'll just leave it there, is being an involved parent. Understanding what your young people are into, and not only in a negative way, but asking, not how was your day-to-day, what did you really enjoy at school today? What was the biggest issue? What was your favorite thing to do today? It's having those conversations, it's journalism 101, not asking the open-ended question, right? Did you have a good day? No, you want to find out more. I'll say this hopefully really quickly, I have a now 11-year-old. Talking with him on the way to school is my favorite part of the day. I tend not to know much about what he's talking about, but it's just really cool to hear his perspective on everything, and to hear him download his worldview on everything from politics to entertainment to sports to school lunch, right? And hopefully I'm doing something right that will keep him out of trouble.
Well, and at that point, it's less of an interrogation and it's more of a conversation. Because I think a lot of parents do the I've been interrogated. Anybody else up here been interrogated by their parent? I think the conversation is the thing that matters.
And it's striking a balance between interrogation and being your kid's friend. Right? Like, I am friendly with my child. I'm not his friend. I am his father, and I am his parent. However, I'm a very involved parent. And please do not look me up for parenting advice, 'cause I'm not that guy.
But for kids that don't have that structure at all, that's why mentorship programs and mentors are really important that can relate to these kids, because a lot of kids don't have that. And I wish they did. I wish there was a lot of kids that did, but a lot don't. So I think mentors is going to be really important as well.
Councilmember Lawson, let's stick with you. We all know kind of the issues with youth violence in the city of Aurora. How is the city of Aurora navigating some of the funding issues for nonprofits and the city agencies while trying to help?
Well, first I want to just make sure that I promote, you know, we're doing Aurora Save, so it's a, you know, a force deterrence program that is going to kind of get some of the 1.34% of the offenders that are really doing the offenses in the city of Aurora. But how we navigate that, it's not easy. We do have, like I said, $400,000 for intervention, $100,000 for prevention. And we do have people that come, a lot of the organizations that come and apply for the funding. And I think where we get a little lost, and then council ultimately decides on who gets the funding. But I think where we get lost is we have the organizations who are doing great work and making those decisions, because you only have so much funding. So you only have so much funding to give. And you really want to support everyone, but you can only give that much. So I think where the gaps are, where I struggle, even as a council person, I think some of my colleagues is, who do we give the funding to? Where are the gaps? What's gonna be important to make the investment in with the kids? And I think what we do is we have all these organizations that are kind of fighting for the funding, and then at the end of the day, we don't see them until the next funding round. So until they do their quarterly report, or till they do something. So I struggle with that, and I think my colleagues do, because we want to see the impacts, and what have been the impacts. So again, I think that that's where a lot of the gaps are. We don't really know where the gaps are, because they come around the next funding source and give a report, and then that's what we have. But if you're not really seeing it, and constituents are letting you know, hey, we're still seeing the uptick in violence, then how do you respond to your constituents about that? And that's I'm not giving you the answer, but I'm saying that's the struggle and the challenge.
So how do they interact with you? What do you see as a good way for a nonprofit to get in front of you and show you what they're doing?
Well, they do get in front of us when they come and apply for the funding.
Beyond that, though.
Yeah, beyond that. But again, I think that there should be something where the nonprofits come together that we're funding and actually see what they're doing. And actually you have some results, or have some of the kids who participate in those programs, the parents or whoever is involved with it, to see if we are making the right funding decisions as a council. Because if we're not, then we need to look at another structure, another way, and how it's going to actually benefit our program as well. In the city of Aurora, it's going to be the Aurora Save program. So what do we need to make that program work?
Keeping in mind we have about 15 minutes left. Jonathan, then Sarah. No, you do not apologize. It's fine.
As a person who did direct services for close to 2 decades and have lost kids who were on my caseload after doing everything I could to save them, there have been times where it's very frustrating to, as a person who's providing services, to be questioned about how good the work is that you're doing. And a good friend of mine who worked for the city and county of Denver just moved, said, you have no idea how many lives you did save. Based off of that one, there may be dozens of other ones. So I say this respectfully, Councilwoman Lawson, let's figure out better reporting metrics than questioning the integrity of some of those people who are putting their lives on the line with active gang members who oftentimes are armed sitting in our passenger seats.
Can I just say one thing? But the money that we have, it's taxpayer dollars. So I understand what you're saying, but we are beholden to the taxpayers that we've had this money. And so I understand that point, but I also understand that we as elected officials are beholden to the taxpayers. And when they're asking me about what this program is doing, and I don't have an answer, then they're looking at me, and especially a person who implemented the program in the city of Aurora.
Jonathan, if you want a chance to respond to that.
Can I jump in
Yeah.
first, Sarah?
Yeah.
Yeah, just, I respect that. I honestly do. I know it's a hypothetical, I would advise that if someone has a question about the work that's being done, they show up at the organization that's doing the work and volunteer and ask, how could I help?
As
Well,
a city,
and one of the challenges is that nonprofits often don't have the staffing or the resources to collect the data that would allow them to demonstrate the impact that their homegrown, very meaningful programs are having on youth and the communities. And so you end up having a really big challenge with getting additional funding resources to help that program continue in the community, because the staff don't have the time, energy, or the experience to collect the data
Capacity.
that shows the decrease in violence or the decrease in problem behavior. We do have a project in Denver right now where we're trying to help organizations build those evaluation skills so that they could then go out for additional funding from other agencies and nonprofits.
Go ahead.
I want to jump in too and say that in the beginning processes, even before the funding is received, just the application process for a grant is so difficult.
I want to say, as a city agency in Denver who does provide grants to community partners, I'd have to agree with Jonathan. I think government does have a role to play, and we do use tax dollars to fund these amazing organizations that do extraordinary work every single day. And Sarah's right. People are having nonprofit organizations because they're there with passion, because they have lived experience, and they're doing the job of 10 people. And they may not have a background in grant writing. Their applications may not be what we want them to be, but that's not our job to judge. And just because they can't provide every single thing we want to know about doesn't mean it's not quality. And it is up to us to change the way that we conduct business, how we provide services and funds, changing our hours to meet the needs of our community partners, not expecting them to show up in the middle of the day, maybe showing up to their organization in the evening when they have time, adjusting the way that we deliver service to meet their needs, because they are working with young people every single day. And I do think it's our job to change the way that we're thinking about data collection, how we support our community partners, how we're funding our community partners, and how we're making it easier for them to apply for funding, because the process is really complicated and complex. And when you're a small mom and pop nonprofit organization, applying for a grant with local government is very complicated. And I don't know if it should be that way. So I would agree with Sarah and Jonathan.
Everybody loves red tape, right? Yes. No, we all hate it. DA McCann, I want to go to you. Has our justice system been too lenient with these kids? Are current punishments for young criminals tough enough to be a deterrent? Should more of them be tried as adults?
Well, that's an interesting question, and I think there are arguments to be made on both sides. I believe that juveniles' brains are not fully developed, and that they are very subject to peer influence, and often do not have the kind of structure and backgrounds that we would like to see. So I think in my office, we try to take into account all of those factors. But we also look at the seriousness of the crime. And unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, we do see a lot of young people committing murder, committing sex assaults, and committing assaults with guns. And my perspective has changed a little bit from the time I first started going into the office thinking, well, we shouldn't be direct filing as adults against children, juveniles. But when I began to see the kinds of crimes that were committed, it was a difficult realization that our juvenile system is really designed for less violent crimes. Because when I have to sit down with the mother of a child who's been murdered, a 16-year-old, and I have to tell her, well, if this child stays in the juvenile system, the most punishment they can get is 5 years. I just can't, in good conscience, do that. So what we tend to do is direct file on murder cases, depending on the age of the child, 16, 17-year-olds. We do tend to direct file because the direct file does give us a lot more options. So we can, as we learn more about this young person and we learn more about the facts of the case, we can remove the case back to juvenile court if we think that's appropriate. We also have the option of the youthful offender system, which is a they have to be filed on as adults to get to be eligible for that, which is a system that is designed to educate and address young people who are involved in very serious crimes, but still could benefit from less than an adult prison system. So that's an option that's available, but only in the adult system. It's a piece of the Department of Corrections. And then, of course, the Department of Corrections is our full adult system. And our preference is not to get young people into the full adult correctional system, but to try to find other options that might be appropriate. But I also have to consider the victims' families and the victims' suffering when they will never see their child again. So when they say to me, how can someone get 7 years when I'm never going to see my child again? So we have to weigh these very, very difficult situations when we're looking at a murder case against a young person. It's heartbreaking because on the one hand, you have a family that's lost a child. On the other hand, you have a family whose child is going to spend time in prison and jail. And so that's why I very firmly support what these folks are talking about, which is starting earlier with these young people, because I firmly believe that that's really where we're going to see more prevention. We do intervention in my office with juveniles, and we have some very successful programs. Our juvenile diversion program and our handgun intervention program both show great success. But we're getting them, after they've already started down that path of criminal behavior. And I think the more we can do up front, the better. So we don't have to deal with families who are dealing with murder situations. So
I'll ask you this. Are you seeing a trend of more kids committing crimes that are maybe encouraged by adults who want to avoid a heftier sentence? Like, are you seeing kids kind of pushed into that system?
I think occasionally there might be, a gang influence will ask a young person to commit the crime, so that, because they know the juvenile system doesn't result in as great a penalty. But I have to say, we don't see that a lot. I think occasionally we will, and certainly, as Jonathan mentioned, the influence of the family, when the family has guns and the family responds to conflict by using guns, that's the role model that these kids see. And so I think there is definitely an influence of older members of a family influencing a younger person to get involved in violence and guns.
Any other perspectives on that?
I'll talk a little bit.
Sure.
So we definitely run into those semi-generational gang families where we're working with the youth. We're pulling them out of their environment for, an hour a week, and we're providing the pro-social skills, we're providing coping tools, we're providing all of these gamut of resources, but we're sending them back to the mouth of the beast ultimately. And they're going back to their families. They're still watching the gang activity. They're still watching the drug activity. They're enmeshed in all of this world. And so how do you really see the productive change when, there's those few youth who they want better, they want to be better, they want to do better, but they're so involved in their every single day life that us pulling them out of their environment is not enough. So, providing safe spaces, of course, we do that. Providing pro-social skills, we do that. But, ultimately, it's really something that the family dynamic, something needs to change.
Melissa, one more question for you before we go to closing statements here. Thank you all. By the way, you've been a very patient audience. We're going a little bit longer than we were since we started a little late. Does the answer to the problem lie in more enforcement? So more severe charges for youth offenders, for example, or giving troubled youth more access to mental health services? Is it enforcement, mental health services, networks? Where's the answer?
I would
Solve
say
the
it's
problem.
not troubled youth, but it's providing all youth with mental health services and supports because they need it. It's not just about when something becomes an emergency. You start early on and have conversation. The pressures for young people are so extreme today, and they need an outlet. They need a trusted adult. They need someone to talk to. They need to build connection. So it's all youth. And if we start earlier on, then they're not troubled. I don't think any youth are troubled. I just think that they need more supports from all of us.
Any other perspectives?
Can I just give my
Councilmember, yep.
perspective? I'm definitely not the expert on this. I'm just kind of giving my thoughts on this. But definitely mental health is really, really significant and important. But I also, too, believe, even when I went back to school, you know, they don't have like the programs like the Scared Straight program and things like that. Like we had those programs. And I'm not saying these kids would even be probably interested in something like that. But I do think that because sometimes some of the youth, it seems like there's no consequences sometimes. And so, you know, you have maybe an older youth or older person who's pushing these kids to do these crimes, which I do believe happens. It doesn't have to be a gang member. It doesn't have to be a family. It could just be someone out there saying, you know what, you're not going to go. You'll go to juvie, and then I won't have to do the crime, but you'll get out. You know, you won't face that many consequences underneath the judicial system. So they're kind of influenced by some of these older adults to commit car crimes, and there's no type of consequence sometimes. And I'm not sure how we can get juveniles to understand that you have choices and there's consequences to the decisions that you make. And again, I do believe it's mental health, but I also believe that there has to be some enforcement too. And hopefully this program that we have will do that in the city of Aurora.
Jonathan? Sorry.
I want to just throw out there that scare tactics don't work, and these programs don't exist for a reason anymore. The DARE program, the Scared Straight, all of these programs don't exist because they don't work, and so we have to shift the way that we work with young people. And I'll stop because I know Jonathan and I are probably going to say something similar.
I saw his microphone fly up, so I assume.
I say, in a moment of transparency, it's not like this is a secret. At the age of 25, was incarcerated in the Department of Corrections here in Colorado. I celebrated my 50th birthday this year, so part of the narrative that drove me to prison was, and it was kind of to like Vince's opening statement, that there was this normalization in this narrative that because I was a young black man in the late 80s, early 90s, that I was more likely to go to prison than college, more likely to drop out of high school, more likely to die before the age of 25. And that created a vacuum that sucked all of the hope out of me in I would say hundreds of thousands of young black men just like me at that time. That narrative hasn't gone away anywhere. In that hopelessness leads to recklessness. So when we have gang members, whether they're OGs or the tiny gangsters, young gangsters, whatever, they don't care about criminal consequences. They are just looking to get the most out of what they think is going to be a short life anyway. So what's going to best redirect that behavior, guess what I'm going to say? It's a caring, trusted adult. Doesn't have to be a parent. Doesn't have to be a mentor. It actually can be law enforcement. I am, as most people would think up here, that I'm against SROs. I'm not against SROs. I'm against SROs who aren't trauma informed, who don't have mental health first aid for young people training, who don't have emotional intelligence training, and are in school buildings with our children with a firearm. Oftentimes, those officers will be the consistent adult in their lives, and so they need to know how to connect with those young people and be those bridges to services and bridges to safety and bridges to justice oftentimes. And so we know that tough on crime, we know that scare tactics have not worked unless we're looking to intentionally build up a criminal justice system that disproportionately impacts people of color. Unless we're trying to see the Crime Act of '92 again, again, and it has, obviously, here we are in 2023 with no huge change in the outcome. So it's just, again, let's shift the paradigm and look for new solutions that are public health informed.
I love that perspective. Anybody else want to join in on that? All right, I have held you all here for far too long. It's already 7:15. If you would all take just 1 minute and just your kind of closing thoughts. We'll start with you, D.A. McCann.
Thank you. Lawyers can't speak for just 1 minute.
Oh yeah, that's right. I'm sorry. Counsel, feel free to do whatever you'd like.
Well, I'm going to try to end on a little more optimistic note because I do think that there are a lot of very important and good efforts going on throughout Denver. I don't know Aurora as well, but I think that we have a lot of committed people who are working very hard to look at juvenile issues and juvenile violence. In my office, as I mentioned, we have the juvenile diversion program, and a young man came and spoke to all of our attorneys who had gone through the program and is now working with young people. But he said an interesting thing. I asked him, well, if you hadn't gotten into diversion, where do you think you would be? And he said, I would be in prison for life. And I was kind of stunned that he said that, but I think maybe Jonathan said this, that there's this idea that you're either going to prison or you're going to be dead. So I think we just have to keep working. I mean, there's the success story right there. And we have to keep working on these kinds of success stories and really recognizing that it's a balance. I don't think it's either law enforcement or mental health or treatment. It's all of it. We have to do all of it. We have to hold young people accountable, but they have to have consequences, but we also have to recognize the struggles that they suffer from in their lives, and we have to be there to support them.
I would agree, but I'll also end with an optimistic closure. I would encourage young people to participate, to be at the table when adults are making decisions that impact you. I encourage adults to be a trusted adult to young people, to think about going into the helping field. We need more social workers and mental health therapists, to people of color that look like us, that speak our language, that represent who we are and understand our cultures, to be in these fields so that we can support young people. So just, be active and pay attention to what government is doing and what all of these organizations are doing and the services that they're providing to you. They're out there.
And I'm going to end on an optimistic note as well. I think one of the important pieces is really listening to the voices of the youth, and I think sometimes what I hear is like, you're not listening to us and their needs, and we do have to meet kids where they're at. And I appreciate all the organizations that are participating and making this, making the lives of the kids and providing options so they can actually get the benefits and whatever their need of where they're at. But I think ultimately this is a regional collaborative process that we all need to be involved in. And I don't care what strategy you have, I don't care what program you have. If we don't have everybody involved, from community to organizations to youth violence prevention organizations that are within a city or a state, I don't care what you're going to do. It's not going to work. Collaboration is key, and working together is key.
Be a caring, trusted adult.
I love him.
Consistently in a young person's life.
Amen. I want to piggyback off that, also off collaboration. I think nobody can do this alone. As one of the panelists mentioned earlier, organizations tend to silo. It's imperative for us to collaborate with other people who are also doing the work to be able to strengthen our numbers and strengthen our organizations to be able to provide additional services, to bounce back and forth. Maybe we don't have a good fit here, but we have a partnering organization where you may be a better fit. It may be a cultural thing. It may be something that we can address personally, but I think if we're collaborating with other organizations, it makes it a lot easier to be able to get people's needs met. One thing I want to also talk about is employing youth at a younger age. We have a program called the Pathfinders program. They are 12 years old up to 24. A lot of work to get that done, but a lot of organizations need to actually put that work in to be able to hire people that are younger. If we don't want them out there selling drugs, if we don't out there robbing and stealing, we got to get them busy.
Yeah, I would agree with everything that's already been said. I want to say thank you to Vince for putting this panel together and just, having this conversation. I think this is one of the first steps, is just getting people to talk about this stuff. Thank you guys for coming and listening. I agree with Jonathan. I mean, I would kind of end it with the adult, like I said, you have to have an adult who can provide guidance and help young people. It's the number one thing. I've seen youth that never thought they would make it to 19 to 20, who had given up all hope, who were fighting every day in facilities, picking up new charges. When they get that mentor that fits with them, completely changes their life. And, some of those kids now are in college and doing good things, and it's just amazing to watch that process. And it does start as simple as having an adult in their life that just cares. So I would echo that.
I would also echo everything the panelists have shared as we wrap up. The two things that I would mention at this point are, one, I think anytime we see another tragedy in the news, whether it's an individual youth dying from violence or a mass shooting, our tendency is to look for a really quick, easy, fast solution, some sort of legislation or some sort of law enforcement action. And I think we need to stop looking for those quick fixes, that as all of the panelists have shared, these are very complicated problems. These are not law enforcement problems. These are not social service or school problems. They are community problems. And it takes all of these different institutions and agencies working together in partnership, using evidence-based practices that we know work well, and supporting the nonprofits that are doing great work in their communities to try to address these problems. And then the second thing I would say is that learn and practice skills for being a good upstander. It really does take people like us seeing someone going down the wrong path, the pathway toward violence, and saying, gosh, what is going on here? Practice those skills with your friends, with your children, so that when the time comes, you know what to say and you know what to do. It's not easy. We have countless examples of how people noticed something and then didn't think there was their place to step in. It is your place to step in. So practice those skills for yourself, for others, and think about who you would contact when you see somebody in trouble, so that you can get them the help they need.
How about a hand for our panel tonight? Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you all so much for watching on denvergazette.com and 9news.com. Have a wonderful night.